Welcome back to the Sales Cadence Podcast. This is the podcast for everyone in sales, because everyone is in sales. We're all selling something. My name is Matt Sykes. I'm your host. I'm the author of the book Sales Glue and Converted. And if, like me, you're as passionate about helping people make truly epic buying decisions so that more people buy what you sell, great news. You're in the right place. Hey folks, welcome back to the Sales Cadence Podcast. Whatever you're doing, wherever you're doing it, I hope life is treating you well. I'm just back from 4 days in leafy Surrey in the UK. To point out, that is the mecca, really, of golf. I'm sure there are people in Scotland that would challenge that point, and probably they'd be right, actually. Scotland is probably the home of golf, but if you want to go and play some really outstanding golf, then Surrey, just south of London, is probably one of the finest places you can go and spend your money and spend your time. And so the last 4 days of last week, I was there with a really good friend of mine, a guy called Alan Henry. If you're a loyal listener to the podcast, you might remember about a year ago, this time last year, I did an episode around the links, I guess, between golf and the role that I played last week, which is caddy and sales. So the point of mentioning that was Alan and I last year tried to get him into the senior Open. And it was at Carnoustie in Scotland. We were trying to qualify at a great golf course up near Dundee called Montefieth. This year, last week, we were down in Surrey and trying to get Alan into the seniors, which has just taken place at Sunningdale. The qualification was at a course called Camberley Heath, which is a stunner of a course, folks. If you are into golf and you can find yourself down there, then I would absolutely encourage you to go and check out Terry Good, who's I think he's the deputy general manager down there, and James, one of the pros. Two fantastic individuals. They met us on day one. We got there a few days early and just couldn't do enough for us. So I'll give a shout out to Camberley Heath Golf Club. Great place to go and spend some time if you're into golf. Unfortunately, it wasn't our year again. We are a lot wiser now. We have more experience, given the fact we've tried twice. And I feel like Alan's got another chance in him. I'll tell you what, when we were in Scotland last year, it was a new experience. Never tried to get into the Seniors Open before, so it was all a bit of a novelty. This year, we were far more prepared. We had more experience. If I'm honest with you, I think we probably went down there a day too early because we got there on the Thursday. We played the course Thursday. We played a different course. Oh, and by the way, folks, if golf is your thing, you need to go and check out Hankley Common Golf Club. I believe it's in the top 30 of the top 100 golf courses. What a stunner that place is. But we played Hankley Common on the Friday, back to Camberley Heath on the Saturday and played that. And you know, Alan's a scratch golfer, as you would expect. Someone who's trying to get into the Seniors Open is going to know what they're doing, right? I've got a reasonably good grasp on how to be a caddy. And between the two of us, we just plotted that course perfectly. And we knew exactly which shots to play. And ultimately, we felt quite confident that we'd have a good chance of going under. What I mean by that is scoring less than par. We actually felt that 4 or 5 under would probably win it. But we felt confident we could get it under par. And maybe if Alan had one of those days, who knew, what might happen. Let me tell you how tough this is, by the way. So the Men's Seniors Open at Sunningdale, there are only 16 spots available to qualify for. And there are 4 tournaments going on with 150 players in total. 600 players are playing for the last 16 spots. So it's a really big ask. And unfortunately, we didn't quite make the grade. We got off to a bad start, but I have to say, Alan was awesome on the back 9. A couple of birdies, and we actually ended up coming in, I think, 4 over. So it was a tough day at the office, but a thoroughly enjoyable time down in Surrey. So look out for next year. We'll try and I'll keep you posted. It's at Royal Birkdale up in Liverpool. Yeah, I think we're going to go for the 3rd time lucky. And hey, listen, if there's somebody there who's interested in getting involved with that, we're always looking for sponsorship opportunities. Too early to talk about it right now, but if you want to get involved with that, then either, hook me up sometime in the future. Also, interesting enough, had another repeat of Mr. Skies. So again, if you're a loyal listener to the podcast, and thank you for that, by the way, you might realize that on occasions when I'm checking into hotels, sometimes my surname is Sykes, and on occasions I'm greeted at reception by a multitude of different surnames, but typically Skies tends to be the main one. I think people may have a problem with getting the Y and the K around the wrong way, and that's fine, no problem. But yeah, I was checking into the a Premier Inn near Luton and got greeted by the welcome, Mr. Skies. And I just brush it off these days. It's part of the territory, I guess. I did get my own back by the way, though. I actually set off the fire alarm by mistake. I didn't mean to, but I didn't realise that the if you spray air freshener in your room, of course it goes up and it attracts the fire alarm. I assume people think you're vaping in the rooms, which you can't do these days. So we're all standing outside this Premier Inn at, I don't know, 8:30 in the evening, and then of course someone in the hotel reception shouts out my room number. And of course I didn't want to get stoned by the mob, so I kept my quiet and kept my silence. But so sorry about that, Premier Inn. It was me that set the fire alarm off, but you should stop calling me Mr. Skies. What else can I tell you before we get into today's podcast? Rambling on a lot. I really apologise for that. Don't mean to. Lots of work going on behind the scenes. Exciting news going to come out. This is the unofficial launch. The official launch will take place in maybe a month or two's time, but I'm going to license Sales Cadence. So I've been doing this now for 12 years. I've been in sales for 27, and I've effectively created a business that is a very good training and coaching company. So I'm on the lookout for people like me. If you've been in sales for a while and you've got a few battle scars and you understand what it takes to help people make great buying decisions, and you have a persuasion to want to run a business and work for yourself, then I've effectively taken all the hard work out of that for you, and you can buy a license in Sales Cadence. If you are curious to know what that license might look like, go onto the website. You'll find a page there, and I don't know, the next few weeks' time I'll probably be a bit more official. But yeah, the Sales Cadence license opportunity is unofficially open. Okay, let's get into today's podcast, and I'm going to meander back to the world of LinkedIn. I put a post out on LinkedIn recently. It was a post related to sales training. Quite a lot of comments, but one of the comments that pricked my curiosity, and it's the reason why we're having this podcast today. And the comment was quite interesting in so much as for two things. First of all, it was great to get comments on LinkedIn posts. I always welcome anybody that's got any comments. It's an opinion-based social media platform at the end of the day, and everyone's got an opinion, and that's cool. And so it was great to get some comments and some feedback. But one of the comments I got quite interested in, and it was from somebody who, well, I'll read out what the comment was. It was in relation, as I said, to a post about sales training and the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of it. But the comment was, the real issue, this is the comment, by the way, the real issue isn't whether great salespeople are born or made. It's that we're still training them like it's the 1990s. Smiley face emoji. While everyone's busy arguing about training effectiveness, they're missing the elephant in the room. Modern day buyers have changed completely in capital letters, rocket emoji. And so the real issue that the comment is provoking is the fact that modern buyers have changed. Now, two things. First of all, I really like and respect that comment, and I want to use today's podcast to tuck into it and truly, I guess, challenge myself to make sure that what they're saying actually does hold validity, because if it does, then I've got to take a real note of that, and also give my take on what I believe to be the case around the modern buyer and whether they have or they haven't changed. I guess, and the second thing is, look, if you're putting posts and comments with smiley emojis and rocket emojis at the end, that is the kind of signature of ChatGPT. So just be mindful. This is a statement to anyone out there who's on LinkedIn. You can see it all the time now, who's using AI to write their posts, or now it looks like even using AI to comment. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I would ask you just to add that human touch to it before you post it, because there are some signature moves of AI, and the smiley face emoji and the ends with the rocket emoji are probably two of the obvious ones. And so today's podcast is exactly that. Has the modern buyer changed? Capital letters completely. Well, look, here's my response. I'm going to effectively go right to the end and do this at the beginning, a bit like an executive summary. In 27 years of sales, maybe I'm not qualified to talk as a modern buyer, because I'm not a modern buyer, although I'm buying in a modern world. And so maybe I'm not qualified to comment on this as someone who's new to the world of sales or new to the world of buying, and is therefore calling themselves a modern buyer because they're, I don't know, younger than me. So I can only comment on what I believe the modern buyer landscape looks like based on 27 years of sales experience. And so my response, executive summary, is exactly that. Yes, the environment for the modern day buyer has changed. Do I think it's changed completely? I'm going to say probably yes. But I'm also going to say to you the fundamentals of buying haven't changed. They remain unchanged. And those fundamentals of buying, of trust, confidence, sort of fear of risk, the absolute need for human connection are still as relevant today as they were 100 years ago. And I just don't believe at the moment, based on what I know and what I see and how I buy myself, that those are going to go away anytime soon. So I don't believe that the modern day buyer has changed completely. I just believe that the environment around them has changed, and therefore there are some subtle changes that buyers today are able to take advantage of.
You're listening to the Sales Cadence podcast with Mike Skies.
So let's look into it and see exactly what we believe has changed. Because there's no doubt about it, certain things have. I guess the first thing I would say is there's definitely a rise in self-research. Okay, so we have an abundance of information. Those of us that remember a time before the internet and then the massive change that the internet brought to us from 20 years ago, since internet was around, we've had this huge abundance of information. And of course, every year it gets better and better. What AI is doing, of course, is taking out all of the heavy lifting of how we go and find that information. It's bringing it to us in seconds. But there's definitely a rise in self-directed research and due diligence, that's for sure. If we use Gartner, who I always like to use as a trusted source of information, Gartner came out, and this is some years ago now, so I'm going to probably point us back to the 19 probably felt like it at the time, 2020 during COVID. There was a lot of information that Gartner were putting out. I guess they had time on their hands to ask people who had time on their hands. But Gartner put out a stat that basically said, now bearing in mind this was 5 years ago, at that time in 2020, Gartner was saying buyers spend only 17% of their buying time with salespeople. And if you then accept the fact that we are happy to accept the classic, we're always talking to 3 different vendors. So we can arguably say around about 5% per seller. And that's all you get. And now that was 5 years ago. And I think that's probably less now because of the amount of time that people can spend using AI to support their due diligence and their efforts. And so now that buyers have got this abundance of information at their fingertips and doing more of it because of this rise in self-appraisal and self-due diligence and self-diagnosis, then we have to accept from a sales perspective that we are meeting a buyer who is already a significant way along their self-diagnosis process. Now, again, I'm not here to tell you anything that you don't already know, especially if you are in sales and you're an advocate of learning the profession and you do listen to sales podcasts and read books and do your own level of learning. We know that for years we've been comfortable with the fact that the buying journey has traveled some distance before they reach out to us. Nothing new there. I would argue it's at least 70% of the way along that journey. And I would say that from a position of, I'm going to say fact, because the work that I do with my clients is always predicated on the fact that we need to understand the way people buy if we're going to go and help them make that buying decision. And of course, our sales process needs to be aligned with how their buying process plays out. And if you think about it from a buying journey, from my work that I do with my clients, there's at least 16 steps. I'm going to argue there's probably 24 in total, but some of those fall after a decision has been made. But if you think about right up to the point when someone actually selects, so they've made their decision, there are ultimately 16 steps that a buyer will take. And so those 16 steps have been traveled before the salesperson is contacted to have a conversation. And if you're in sales and you aren't aware of that, then you're in real danger of being too late to that conversation. Now, there's no excuse for it because you have as much access to information that buyers do. And so a lot of the work that I do with my clients now is saying, well, look, let's just pretend we're a buyer and let's look at those 16 steps and let's travel them together. And what can we learn? What can we find out that's going to help us mirror, if you like, how this buyer is going to go through a decision-making process. Now, so I have an open course called Leads to Sales, and in that course, we go through those 16 steps. So, but if you're interested in knowing more, and you can get yourself to Norwich, where I live in the UK, 12th of September, I'm hosting a one-dayer. You'll find all of the details are on my website. Go to salescadence.co.uk. On the homepage, scroll down, you'll see a Leads to Sales image. Click through that. It'll take you to a landing page where you can sign up. So yeah, has the modern day buyer changed? Yes, it has changed. We have to accept that they have even more information and far less friction when it comes to finding and getting their hands on that. What comes with that, of course, that rise in self-diagnosis, is a proliferation of information. There is probably information overload. And what that information overload has to bring, is a level of uncertainty. You've got even more information coming at me about how I fix my problem, what might happen to me when I do fix it, what would the outcomes be, and therefore who do I need to go and find who's married up to make my life easy when I go and select a salesperson. This information overload has created more uncertainty. And again, I go back to Gartner, always a very good source of information. 50% of buyers experience more confusion the more content they consume. Okay, so that's not my stats, that's Gartner's stats. They've gone out to hundreds of buyers and said, this rise in information, is it putting you in a better position or a worse position? And the overriding feedback they're getting from B2B buyers is actually it's bringing confusion. Too much information overload. And so, if you're in the world of sales today, you have to accept the fact that because this landscape has changed, this information overload exists, and that is a problem for anyone in the B2B buying space, then your job is how do you help solve that problem? And the way that you help solve that problem so that a buyer isn't paralyzed, they're empowered to make a decision, is you have to create this ability to curate information. You've got to help them find some way of cutting through the noise rather than just adding to it. And so a skill that you can start to consider if you're in sales is, how do I make it easier and clearer for my buyer to understand the information that's in front of them? Another clear indication that the modern buyer has changed somewhat is the fact that buying groups continue to get larger. And because they continue to get larger, they become harder to manage. Let's go back with some stats. Let's start this point off with a bit of factual evidence. Harvard Business Review stat says 6 to 10 stakeholders in a complex B2B sales. Again, not new information. That kind of stat has been banded around for years now. I guess what's important to know is, whilst there's an increase in number of stakeholders surrounding the buying process and therefore all having an influence in how the ultimate decision is made, we have to accept also that not only is that number of stakeholders increased, each of those stakeholders will have their own agenda. And so if you think back to the fundamental buyers that we know of, and there's an economic buyer, a technical buyer, there'll be a user buyer, someone who actually uses what it is that they ultimately sell on a day-to-day basis. Each of those three examples of buyers, and there are others, are going to have a slightly different agenda that still means ultimately they want to solve a problem or improve something. But a technical buyer is going to have a slightly different agenda to perhaps an economic buyer. You think of a technical buyer, they're probably going to want to spend money to get the best possible technical solution. Why? Because they have an exceptional interest in technology, and therefore they're always looking for the next best thing. But equally, of course, they want it to work. And it's fair to say, in most cases, things that tend to be slightly more expensive have a better chance of working. I know that's a general statement, but you get where I'm going with it, right? And so therefore, a technical buyer is less concerned about investment and budget level. And we would be comfortable to say, wouldn't we, that an economic buyer would probably be the opposite. Of course, they want things to work, but they want to purchase at the most acceptable and commercially beneficial price point they can. And so you can already see there that there's a disconnect between two people who both want the same ultimate objective, but coming at it from slightly different places. I guess the other point to say around buyer groups as well is, and it's probably more indicative of the current economic climate we find ourselves in. Obviously, I'm based in the UK. I've got listeners all around the world. Funny enough, got listeners in Australia now. Welcome some new listeners recently. G'day, folks. Here in the UK, economic times are quite challenging. I suspect it's the same in many other countries as well. But as a consequence of that, non-critical spend comes under the spotlight when economies are challenged. And as a result of that, there's more control put in about how an organization goes through a spending money journey. And there's some evidence, certainly from some of the clients I've spoken to, and in fact, some of the deals I've been trying to get over the line recently have been restricted and slowed down because the threshold for sign-off has been reduced so low, and therefore the number of people at a higher level required to sign off has got much bigger, that ultimately people lose the appetite to do anything and decide it's just too much like hard work. And so there's a lot of moving parts in this point. I guess the most important thing to bear in mind, though, is we probably, as much as we all love that phrase multi-threading, for those of you who aren't aware of it, is understanding who will be in that committee of buyers, who are those influencers, those stakeholders we've talked about, or that HBR talks about as those 6 to 10 people. Who are they? Well, we can quite easily go and do our best to work that out for ourselves, be that through, AI will serve up some names for you. You can go on LinkedIn. There are other sources of company information, of course. So you can kind of come up and map it out yourself, this multi-threading approach of starting with mapping out who those people are. And then the threading part is actually reaching out and having a conversation with them. Sounds a lot easier than it is. In practice, it's quite hard. Can be done, of course, and should be done, because you're in a much better position to help someone make a quantifiable and accurate choice if you're able to have one-to-one conversations with people. If we think back to that last point about the various different buyers, then of course, you are only going to help a technical person solve their agenda points if you can have a conversation with them. Now, that ability to have a conversation direct is the hard part, because that takes effort. It takes work. You can't just connect on LinkedIn and assume you've got a hotline to an economic buyer. You've got to do the hard work then of finding a way of starting that conversation. But here's the point. What we will always find in most cases is an organization has put up one individual. Often we refer to that person as the champion, so let's use that expression. They will put up the champion, and the champion's job is to have the conversation with the salesperson and almost guide and direct that conversation through to its natural conclusion. And when you look at it like that, if you aren't able to help that champion, who in some cases may not even have high influence, in some cases may have just been sent out to do the heavy lifting, to fact find, to ask the questions, to get the information. If we aren't able to get to a position with that champion where we can help them feel convinced that what we offer makes sense for them personally, as a representative of that business, then you've got no real chance of setting them free back into their business to go and be your salesperson. Because in reality, what you are creating there is a relationship where you are interviewing a champion to be a salesperson for your company. Because that's basically what's about to happen when you end your conversation with them and you send your quote or your proposal, because you're giving that information to them to go and deliver it and sell you to the buying committee. So really sort of a key point around this whole kind of champion thing is you've got to understand 2 things. Number one, are they useful to you? Do they have some skin in the game? Quite often they might not have any form of influence whatsoever, and you've got to be very careful with those kind of people, because what's the point? So number one, are they going to be useful to you? And number 2, have you been able to reach a position where they feel passionate and convinced that what you offer makes sense for them to put their reputation on the line and put you in front of the other guys and girls that ultimately make the decision? And so I guess if there was one final thing I'd say about this whole modern buyers have changed completely is, as we've discussed, time spent with sellers is definitely shrinking. I saw a stat from McKinsey that says up to 80% of B2B buyers today prefer remote or digital self-service. Again, playing a little bit onto that point I said earlier around self-diagnosis, there's some clear evidence that would suggest, yes, that's not only true, but is increasing. Why on earth wouldn't you spend more time behind your laptop doing research rather than spending time on a Teams call finding out information that could be biased? So there's loads of truth in that point. And so if we sort of summarize those sort of 4 key areas we spoke about, number 1, there's an increase in self-diagnosis. That's definitely changed in the modern buyer. Number 2, there is this, what comes in partnership with that self-diagnosis, is this abundance of information and an information overload. And so there is definitely a need to try and help somebody get clearer on the important information they need to see, and almost curate and cut through some of the chaff that they don't. There's definitely an increase in buyer group size and probably an increase in buyer sign-off level, a lowering in that level. That's certainly what I see anyway. It may not be the same for you, but it's certainly true in my world and in my clients' world as well. And there's this rise in self-service. So yes, happy to accept that the environment for buyers today, let's call them the modern buyers, is changing, but I don't think it's changed completely. Because here's what, in my experience of 27 years, and I see today hasn't changed. Number one, and this will always be the case, trust still drives purchasing confidence. And our job as salespeople is to almost be that filter for risk, because risk is the thing that stops people from being confident. If we can find a way of mitigating that risk, then confidence comes. And if you think about buyers, and we are buyers ourselves, so we can put ourselves in the situation right now, at this moment, as being a buyer of something, we have a bit of a filter that we need to put our sales decision through, which is, am I going to make the wrong choice? Am I better off buying something completely different that's going to serve me better? Or should I spend my money on this thing? Shall I go and buy myself a new car? Or shall I pause buying a new car and actually go and spend that money, or at least some of it, on a really fabulous holiday away somewhere? And so the first issue is wrong choice. And there's a risk that comes with making the wrong choice. The next risk is then, if I decide I'm going to go and buy this car, let's use car as an example, am I going to buy the wrong car? I'm going to buy the wrong brand, the wrong make, picking the wrong partner is a risk I need to solve. And then finally, if I pick the right partner, how do I know it's going to actually work? Again, poor example, but we'll stick with it because I seem to have started with it. Don't know why. Oh, I know why, because I want to talk about BMWs in a minute. So yeah, pick the right brand. I'm going to go with BMW, but don't want to pick the wrong choice of car. Got my heart set on a certain car. If I buy that car and I find that's not the one for me, I'm going to have this buyer's remorse. And so you can start to see how there's a lot of risk associated with any decision that we make as buyers. And so getting beyond that risk and building trust is crucial. And that hasn't changed. I don't see it changing anytime soon. I have no idea what AI is going to do in the future. But right at this moment in time, do I think that trust is going to be eradicated from the modern buyer's buying journey completely? Not in cat and else chance. And so if I use cars and BMW, I'm a BMW guy. I've had a few BMWs in my time. I've just bought a new one. In fact, just bought two, one for my wife and one for myself. And yes, I do like the brand. That's why I've always bought BMWs. But I have to say that what's driving that are the people that work in that organization. And so for a number of years now, I've been quite friendly with the dealer principal at my local BMW dealership. Right? We have a good relationship. We're not friends, but he reaches out to me from time to time and checks in. There's one young guy who handled my purchase of those two cars recently. He was very, very good, a very, very capable individual. And as far as I'm concerned, and I do this for a living, I teach people how to sell, he did a very, very good job. Handled it in a very professional, credible, trustworthy and ethical way. Can't ask for any more than that. I think another thing that's really important to consider is that we are, and always have been, and again, no idea what's going to happen in the future, but I just don't see this changing either, is we are still tribal. We are a social species. If you think back to even just the classic fundamentals of psychology, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. For those of you that are not familiar, there are effectively 5 levels in the hierarchy, starting at bottom and leading up to top. Bottom is physiological. Yeah, physiological. I think the second one is safety. Then you've got love and belonging. Then you've got esteem. And finally, at the top, you've got self-actualization. And so if we think about the first level, the fundamental principles of physiological hierarchy of needs, then that's water and shelter. Okay, we don't need that in the world of buying and selling. The second one is safety. And safety is about personal well-being. It's about a stable environment. It's about those things like financial security. And we do need safety. You will find safety within the B2B decision-making process. And safety is that ability to eliminate or at least mitigate, be aware of, and then be comfortable with a level of risk. The third one is love and belonging. So family, friendship, community, group membership. And we've talked about that earlier on in this podcast about belonging. And belonging is about team consensus. It's about, I'm going to make a decision on behalf of my business, and my business I represent is full of other people and part of a tribe and part of a belonging. And I'm not just going to make this decision on my own. I'm going to involve others in this kind of buying process. So we can definitely see that belonging is key when it comes to a social need being met and making that a link between how people buy and how we sell. The fourth level of Maslow is esteem, self-respect, confidence, reputation, recognition, achievement. And esteem does come into play because people don't want to make the wrong decision. I don't know any buyer who wakes up in the morning thinking, well, how many shit buying decisions can I make today? They don't think that way. It's silly to think that way. It's silly to even mention it, but it's a statement of fact. Nobody wants to make the wrong decision. Why? Because they want a level of esteem in their lives. They want, if I'm honest with you, they want a recognition that they've made the right decision. And even further, people want to rise up the corporate ladder, if that's your persuasion, based on making decent choices that people can see, they can recognize you, can trust you moving forward, and will then take you up the career ladder. You can go and influence at a higher level. And so what does that mean for level 5, self-actualization? That's all about personal growth, purpose, and meaning. You can start to see how level 4 esteem does fit into that. So, I think there's enough in Maslow to say none of those things, well, there are at least 3 of the 5, possibly even 4, they're not going to go away anytime soon. And so this tribal need, this recognition, this fact that we are social animals, and I believe will continue to be so, that's not going to change. That's going to stick around for some time. Look, what advice can I offer on this podcast? Well, I guess only one, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 things. I guess if you're a sales leader listening to this right now, and let's go right back to the point of this podcast, which is, has the modern day buyer changed completely? No. Is the environment they're in changed? Yes, it has changed, and it's continued to change, and it will continue to evolve. And none of us really know to what extent it will continue to evolve at. But at right this moment in time, absolutely, the environment has changed, but it's not changed completely. There are still some fundamental things there. And if I'm a sales leader, or you're a sales leader and you're listening to this, I would heavily encourage you to sit down with your team and unpack all of the complexity that they see in their world, in their marketplace, in front of their buyers. What are the things that are challenging them to do their job effectively for you as a sales leader? If you think of the complexities of today, let's just touch on 3. Number 1, there are multiple stakeholders in deals. This has been the case for some years, nothing new here. But if we go with that 6 to 10, if you're only speaking to one, there are somewhere between 5 and 9 that you're not speaking to. And so you need to explain to me, or they need to explain to you, how there's a level of confidence in that deal that's sitting in the pipeline that says it is going to close if they haven't got anywhere near the 90% of conversations they need to have. So I think the first thing is just be mindful of this growing number of stakeholders that are in deals. And that second point I mentioned earlier around how thresholds for sign-off have probably reduced. And so therefore getting sign-off is a little bit harder. Number 2, I think I would be mindful of this plethora of content. We are saturated by information these days. Nobody needs any more content, folks. What they need is clarity. And so accept the fact that your buyer is going to be hit with this abundance of information, and your job, or your sales team's job, is to bring them, pinpoint, and then bring to them, curate the essential pieces of information that they're going to need in order to advance their buying decision. And then the third thing I would say, and this is not really related to this podcast, but it's a common thread throughout everything that I do and everything I see and the work I do with my clients, is, especially during economic times of challenge, the sales process is not linear. Jordan Belfort, straight line selling. I'm not here to comment about Jordan Belfort, but there is some common sense that says we go from A to B, B to C, C to D, D to E, E to F, as all of the many sales processes that are out there have taught us in the past. And in the same way that I have a 6-step process teaches as well, ultimately there's a step-by-step process, But at the moment, and especially during times of economic challenge, that can get quite complicated. So it's not linear. It can go in different directions. Clearly, you've got to bring it back to that line, but they stop and they start, and that's okay. Deals stop and start even more so when people are required to go and have conversations about sign off at lower levels. So you've got to empower your team to know how to remain consistent, ethical, persistent, and have some framework that allows that conversation to maintain and continue. And so you do need to have some kind of framework for your sales team. Otherwise, they're probably going to be winging it. And so, finally, I would say that, I should remind you that LinkedIn comment, which was the real issue isn't whether great salespeople are born or made, is that we're still training them like it's the 1995s. Well, actually, there's some stuff in 1995 I think that's still true, still good, still valid. I mean, we've talked about the psychological impact of Maslow. That's been around way before the 90s. Look, sales isn't dead. The fundamental principles of sales haven't really changed. What's changed is bad sales is now even easier to see. And again, the only way you avoid selling badly is to know how to sell in a far more effective, coherent and logical way. The best sellers that I'm aware of are the ones that create simplicity and certainty in this kind of ever-changing, ever-increasing complex world. But they still have that ability to anchor back to the good old-fashioned human-to-human type skills and qualities that exist. I'm not saying go back to the bad old days, far from it. But what I am saying is don't give up some of the fundamental best practices that worked in the past that continue to work today. You think about the principle that people buy emotionally first and they justify intellectually. You can't argue against that. That's true. Everything that you've ever bought, you bought based on emotion first, and then you decided intellectually it was the right thing to do, and you went ahead and you bought that thing. And if you're a sales leader and you've got a sales team, and I can think of one specific person who'll be listening to this right now, but you can't tell me that people in your industry don't sell the technical aspects of paints and coatings before they sell the emotional need of why that individual would want them. And so most people, I believe, in the sales world who haven't been trained will try and sell logic first and almost forget the emotion part. They do it the wrong way around. The people that say, I need more technical information, if I could just learn a bit more about how my product and service works, I'll get more sales. People clearly are going to be interested in your data sheet, but not at the expense of what's in it for them. And what's in it for them is that emotional desire, that emotional requirement they need to allow them to go on and decide, yes, I want to know more, and now I'm ready for the logical, technical stuff that helps me intellectually decide that my emotional decision to use this or go with this supplier was the right thing to do. And so how do you bring emotion to the forefront? I guess the basics, really. You've got to ask those emotional type questions. I remember I had a conversation recently with a potential client, prospect client. I have a retainer service, so I go into organizations on a 6-month retainer period, and we were talking together about how this might potentially work. And I could sense that there was some kind of risk, even though we were getting towards the end of the conversation. And I said, look, and here's a great example of an emotional question. Looks like you're still a little bit undecided, so can I ask a question? What is the biggest risk you see that's stopping you from moving forward with this sort of 6-month retainer? It's a great emotional question to ask. You're asking someone to dig deep and identify to almost I wouldn't say a complete stranger, but someone they don't really know intimately, who's just asked them a question about what is the biggest, show me why you don't want to move forward. What's the biggest risk that's stopping you from progressing? And after about 10 seconds, the individual came back and explained to me that the biggest risk for getting me involved was me identifying something that they think they've identified themselves, which is there's somebody in their team that probably shouldn't be in it. Wow, fantastic. Here's a groundbreaking moment where they already see somebody in their team who they don't think is going to stand the test of time. Asking emotional questions can start to unlock really good conversations. I would then say you've got to start to use the right language then at that point. The language of emotions around a relief, creating impact, belief, desire, need, all those kind of things. And so the next part of the conversation was, well, okay, let's pretend that is the case. Let's pretend that within a couple of months of me working with you, we do find that that individual that you're already slightly concerned around actually is in the wrong role. Would you personally feel vindicated that someone like me, a fresh pair of eyes with experience, actually thinks the same way as you? If that is the case, how would you feel about that? And so asking that person to share what their feelings would be around being, if you like, validated, if that's the right word, is another way of bringing emotion into a conversation before we start to go into the world of intellectual and logical justification. Because ultimately when it comes down to, people making emotional decisions and choices, sometimes you've got to bring their internal fears to the surface when you're having a sales conversation. Not to try and wind people up, but to bring it to the surface, discuss it, and then effectively neutralize it. Bringing that point to that person who was slightly concerned that bringing him in would kind of confirm that somebody that they've got in their team wasn't probably right and shouldn't be in the team anymore. Actually, basically what I said to them, the fact that they even mentioned it to me has got to make them feel good now, almost like they brought this problem to the surface, they've shared it with somebody, and now that sort of sense of relief, problem shared is a problem halved. Now you can go ahead and you can start to solve it and address it. Now I've no idea if they'll end up being a client or not. The point remains the same. People buy emotionally first and they justify intellectually. I will be surprised if they don't decide to sign. Let's see. But if they don't, good news, we've at least exposed there's something going on behind the scenes that person's going to have to either address themselves or they're going to have to bring in someone like me to help them address it. Or the way that they deal with that, of course, is the logical justification. Something else that comes from the good old days as well is, great questions obviously start conversations. Of course they do. But, listening is more important than pitching. Again, nothing new there. Questions build trust a lot faster than if we make claims about our business or our organization. I remember one of the very first videos I ever watched on sales. I'm going to go back 15, 16 years ago. And I think that video was probably 10 years older. So I'm going to go back 25 years. Was a guy called Tom Hopkins. And Tom Hopkins was very famous in the world of real estate. But classic 1980 sales guy, right? Quite a lot of that stuff now you just couldn't get away with. But one statement that still rings true today from Tom Hopkins is, if I say it, they doubt it. If they say it, it must be true. And the point behind that is you've got to help people make a case for their own change. People have got to verbalize and decide that what they do is the right thing for them. Our job as salespeople is to help them get there. And so, yes, it starts with asking great questions, but it's a lot about how you listen. There's a lot of buzzwords around like active listening, but ultimately, if you break it down, you've got to find a place in which you start a conversation and allow the buyer to feel heard and safe to share that information. I had to find a place for that conversation I just shared with you then, where the prospect themselves felt safe enough to expose the fact that they've got some challenge within their team. They're not going to do that if I can't create that environment of safety where they can be listened to and heard. And, I'm not a huge believer in those training methods of matching and mirroring. I'm sure they have a place. I don't go anywhere near it myself. For me, I'm far more into the world of empathy. And so when someone is answering your questions and you genuinely feel empathetic towards their answer, then there is nothing better than confirming that you feel the same way as them. And so that sounds frustrating, or I'd do the same thing if I was in your situation, or I can understand why you said that. All of those kind of responses are really good ways of showing someone that you've listened because you're aligning yourself with them. I guess the last thing I would think of, again, we're sort of taking this conversation, randomly, almost like we're now pulling stuff from the old days and seeing if it's still true today. And one of the things I learned, very, very early in my sales career was the importance of language. And a very old, tried and tested, probably used in lots of training rooms, is the example of that sort of airline pilot conversation. We're all comfortable in the presence of an airline pilot when we're sitting and we strap ourselves in and we listen to the airline pilot and he speaks or she speaks in a certain way. It's very controlled, it's very calm, it's typically downward inflection, and we feel confident in their presence. There's no, it's just very matter of fact, isn't it? You expect somebody who's about to take charge of 350 people and fly at 500 miles per hour at 35,000 feet. You kind of need a bit of confidence there, don't you? And so that sort of downward inflection is more of a statement, trust, confidence, fact, rather than an upward inflection, which is question or uncertainty or what do you think? And so, been around forever, but downward inflection statements they create the room for trust. They create the opportunity for confidence. Structure as well in the conversation. Here's what's about to happen next, or let me walk you through what will happen next. Let me show you and guide you what's going to happen on this call. Or after we finish this, most people would typically go and do that. Trying to create some kind of structure clearly can help as well when it comes to bringing calm and credible confidence in the conversations that you have. And even some of the other stuff I've learned from earlier on where, the phrase I think, and I probably use the phrase I think a few times on this perhaps, but I think is subjective to me. That's my opinion and might not be the same as the other person. So if we go back to the Tom Hopkins point of if I say it, you'll doubt it. So I think is me saying it. If I say it, you'll doubt it. If you say it must be true, then rather than I think, swap it and say based on what you've told me. Start to see how some of this old stuff still works today, right? Look, talked for ages and quite a lot of it's just been rambling on, and hopefully you've found some common sense in some of it and some, advice and inspiration perhaps in others. But what can we say? Has the modern buyer changed completely? No, of course not. But modern buyers' environment has changed and will continue to change. What we can say about today's buyer is they definitely are more agile. They're faster because they've got more information at their hands and they can move quicker. That in itself brings more challenge with how they spend their time. So the modern buyer is not only faster, they're also busier and they are more distracted. There is a huge amount of opportunity out there if people are willing to go and spend their time looking for it. And so there's a lot of distraction as well. But they haven't changed completely. They haven't mutated. They're still human at the end of the day, and they still have this incessant desire to be not only treated as a human, but to be spoken to as a human and then be in front of a human as well. Because humans need those fundamental basics that we talked about. They need confidence. They don't need confusion. They need connection. What they don't want is distant content being dumped at them from a great height. And they need a seller who shows up and brings clarity and confidence and eliminates risk so that they can be trusted. And again, I'm going to go back probably 15 years. Anthony Iannarino was probably the most prevalent sales authority to talk about the phrase trusted advisor. Sellers want people that can give them advice and that can be trusted. And so that trusted advisor statement, again, that's not going away anytime soon either. So look, in a world of too much information, let's just finish this podcast with this, what's going to make the difference between someone who's really effective at selling and someone who isn't is the ability to bring clarity to a buyer, to demonstrate confidence, because clarity and confidence, in my experience, become effectively the currency of today's modern decision-making process. That's what the modern buyer wants. That's it. That's the podcast. Folks, thank you so much for your ears. Thank you for listening. Don't forget, if you're in and around Norwich in the UK on the 12th of September, come along and spend a day with me. I promise you'll have an exceptional experience. We'll have a lot of fun together as well. We'll go through that buyer's journey, and I'll also share with you that 6-step framework as well that helps you turn uncertainty and doubt into confidence and clarity. And again, look out on the next podcast. Probably I'll spend a bit more time talking about the sales cadence license opportunities as well. So thanks for tuning in. As always, be good to your friends and family, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Sales Cadence podcast.